Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
This conversation is called The Fourth Man. Now, sounds very mysterious. We'll find out who the fourth man is in due course, I'm sure, Mike. What part of the Bible are we looking at?
We're going to be looking today at a story in the book of Daniel. Daniel is a fascinating story and one that's really relevant for today because it shows us how we can be faithful to God in an alien culture, standing true for God and yet still being used in the culture in which we live without having to conform ourselves to its values and beliefs, and yet find opportunities to give our God-given wisdom in that place.
So who was Daniel and in what culture was he living?
Well, we meet Daniel not in Israel or Judah, where the vast bulk of the story of the Bible occurs, of course, but we actually meet him in Babylon. Now, how on earth has he got into Babylon? Well, we saw in a previous episode how Jerusalem had eventually been conquered by this rising nation of Babylon. The great empire to the east had been Assyria, and Assyria was the power that had conquered Israel, the northern part of the kingdom of God's people, way back in 721 BC. But eventually, Assyrian power had crumbled, and in 612 BC, Babylon had ended up swallowing up its empire. So that meant now that Babylon was on the doorstep of Judah, the southern part of God's people. Now, the border was only, 20 miles or so from the capital of Jerusalem. And Babylon was a real expansionist empire. And so it had got its eyes on Judah and what lay beyond. Ultimately, that would have been Egypt, of course. And so it begins to put pressure on Judah, first of all, long before its final attack. And part of that pressure involved two early deportations of some of its leading people, one in 605 BC, one in 597 BC, before the final complete exile in 586 BC. Now, in that first one, in 605 BC, what Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, did was to take some of the key leaders, people he felt might have been a threat, of course, from Judah and deport them to Babylon, where they will spend the rest of their life. And that's where we encounter Daniel. He was one of those young men from the royal family, it seems, who had been deported to Babylon. And while he is there, we discover in chapter 1, he's selected to become part of a group of men to be trained for service to the king of Babylon. So this is going to be interesting. This is a young man, Daniel, and his three friends who come into the story that we look at, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, who will have to learn the ways of the Babylonians, yet stay true to their faith in Yahweh, the living God, during this time of training. And chapter 1 is a fascinating story of how they wisely steer their way through these challenges while remaining true to their faith and yet being able to show their incredible wisdom that came from God to those who were in charge of them.
So they've been plucked, as it were, from their homeland in Jerusalem, and they're now in Babylon. How different was that culture? I mean, we think of Babylon with its hanging gardens.
Oh, incredibly different. I mean, first of all, a very beautiful city. Babylon itself was a magnificent city, huge walls that you could drive, chariots around, and the hanging gardens of fame and so on. An incredibly beautiful city, but culturally incredibly different. I think in a number of ways. One is, of course, it was utterly polytheistic. It believed in many gods. And while Babylon would have had their own gods in particular for that city, and Nebuchadnezzar had his own god, probably Nabu, after whom he was named. They were polytheists at heart. So here you've got all these gods you're expected to worship, and yet you believe in one God. There is only one true God. You've got all the Babylonian myths and stories of wonderful stories of how the world was brought into being, and yet you know your story from the traditions of Scripture that it came into being by the actions of the one true God alone, carefully, beautifully bringing everything into being, not because the gods got into a fight and ended up creating the world out of a dead God's body, which is what one of the stories said. So very different socially, very different religiously, and therefore very different culturally, of course, in how all that would have got expressed. So they're coming into a hugely different world. I mean, one of the little things that they will face that we meet in chapter 1, they're put on this training program and beautification program to get them ready to serve the king. And they get all these wonderful fine meals and meats that are given to them. But of course, Daniel realizes that all these meats would have been offered as sacrifice first to the pagan gods. So that's one reason they're not kosher meat. They won't have had the blood drained from in the way that Jews had to. So suddenly they're faced with having to do this. And in an incredibly wise way, he goes to the guy in charge of them and says, look, would you be prepared to test us for a while? Because I think there could be a better diet than this. Could you just give us vegetables to eat and water to drink? And I don't think that was particularly because he was a vegetarian, but it was the one way he could, of course, avoid eating meat that had been offered to idols or that wasn't kosher. And the guy's not too sure, but Daniel persuades him and says, well, come on, let's give it a go and we'll see how it goes. And of course, at the end of the trial period, even of 10 days, the guy sees that they're healthier and better nourished than any of those who've been living on the rather fatty and overfine royal foods. And then God starts to give them incredible wisdom and understanding. So they're not frightened of engaging with the culture. They don't run from it. They don't go off into a holy huddle and say, oh no, we couldn't possibly get involved in that. But they are looking constantly for ways of how can we engage with the culture, yet stay true to our faith and true to our God. And rather than be confrontational, they look for wise ways. What's a wise way that we could get what we are looking for, but make it look like it's going to be better for them? Still a good principle for today, by the way.
I've heard a definition of culture, a simple one, which is the way things are done around here.
Yeah.
In Babylon, how were things done around here? I mean, you mentioned King Nebuchadnezzar is named after a pagan god.
Yes. I mean, how things were done around here was that it was the pagan gods that triumphed. But the biggest way that things were done around here was that Nebuchadnezzar said, jump, and your only response was, how high would you like me to jump? Nebuchadnezzar was an incredibly intelligent guy, it's clear, but he was also incredibly ruthless and incredibly proud. And all of that comes out, by the way, in these early chapters of Daniel, let alone in other non-biblical literature. So how things were done around here is the way that Nebuchadnezzar wanted them done around here, with the gods that Nebuchadnezzar wanted honoring. And in chapter 2, we find an interesting challenge to that, a sowing of the seeds that would perhaps undermine some of Nebuchadnezzar's thinking, in that he has a dream. Now, dreams, as we've said before, were very important in the ancient world. It was believed that the gods spoke to you through dreams. And so he has a dream that he doesn't know the meaning of, and so he has all these wise men and priests who can interpret dreams, but he goes to them, and rather than telling them the dream and wanting them to interpret it, he says, I want you to tell me what the dream was and interpret it. And they, in as nice a way as possible, say, come on, Your Majesty, no, nobody has ever done that. And we read that this made the king so angry and furious, he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So there's the sort of guy he is. He doesn't get his own way. By the way, he's going to execute all the wise men. Daniel and his friends have just been promoted to the group of all the wise men. So Daniel is now included in this. And again, Daniel is so wise here, and he gets an opportunity to offer to interpret, well, first to tell him what the dream was and to interpret it to Nebuchadnezzar. Now remember, this guy doesn't suffer fools gladly.
And he doesn't know Daniel from Adam.
Absolutely not. He knows he's just one of his wise men, and he probably had hundreds and hundreds of those. So this guy's really, going to take his life in his hands in going to Nebuchadnezzar. This is not sort of a little prophetic word. I feel, David, the Lord wants to say he wants to bless you. This is, I have got to get right what the king dreamt and what God was saying through it. Well, blow me, Daniel gets it. He goes and seeks God. He gets what the dream was. He interprets it to the king. The king recognizes the truth of this and therefore honors not only Daniel, but his friends. We read at the end of chapter 2 that he placed Daniel in a high position, lavished many gifts on him, made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon, placed him in charge of all the wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. So through Daniel's courage, faith, confidence that he could hear God, he challenges this guy who is very used to things being done round here in the way that he wants them to be, had threatened to destroy all his wise men when they couldn't line up with that, and yet Daniel seeks God and finds a way forward. This is some courageous guy, but again and again, he is engaging with the culture rather than running from it, but again and again, not bowing to the culture, not swallowing it, but seeking to bring God's ways and God's culture into the situation.
You said Nebuchadnezzar sort of honoured Daniel and his friends. Did he honour Daniel's God?
Well, yes, he does, but it's at a pretty superficial level to start with. I mean, he actually says at one point, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." But it's clear as the story goes on, this is not a wholehearted turning. I think what's happened is he's included God into his pantheon of gods. God's become another of those gods, but actually a pretty serious one, a pretty high up one, but he's still really one of many, as even the next chapter will go on to show us.
So Daniel's God is one of Nebuchadnezzar's many gods.
Yeah, and we see that as we do go into chapter 3, because chapter 3 begins with King Nebuchadnezzar making an image of gold 90 feet high and 9 feet wide and setting it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, sometimes people have assumed that the image was an image of him. That's very, very unlikely. It's far more likely to have been an image of one of his god, probably his favorite god, probably this god Nabu, after whom he was named. So there again is part of the answer to the question you'd asked previously, how did he respond? Well, yeah, Yahweh becomes one of the gods, but hey, he's not knocked all the other gods off the pedestal yet, because here in chapter 3, he's setting up this huge golden image of what was almost certainly his God and calling upon everyone to have to bow down to it. So really what he's doing here is, he's a polytheist, remember. He acknowledges there are many gods, but he's wanting everyone now to bow down to his preferred God, his chief God. So it's still not Yahweh. It's still not the living God. And we get this lovely little passage where he sends a message out across the community and says, "This is what you're commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language." In other words, right across the empire. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace.
So is he expecting Daniel and his friends to do the same?
Oh, absolutely. You know, there's no exemptions here. There's no passers to get out of this one. Everyone right across the whole empire is expected to do this.
That's going to be difficult for Daniel and his friends.
It's going to be impossible for Daniel and his friends. And as we've already seen, the one thing Daniel will not do is compromise his faith. He'll look for wise ways to express it. He'll look for wise ways to use it. But he is not going to compromise, because remember, this is Nebuchadnezzar really wanting people to acknowledge that this God, represented by this idol, Nabu, is the king of the whole earth. He's the ultimate supreme God. Now, how can you be a believer in the one true living God and acknowledge that? So as this process begins, and I've often thought what the sound must have been like with the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music blasting away there. But when the orchestra strikes up and everyone has to come to this gold statue and fall down before it. But of course, Daniel and his three friends can't. And there are some very, very jealous advisors and magicians left in the nation. Why? Well, because Daniel has just been promoted over all the top of them, hasn't he? And then he's asked that his three friends be promoted as well. So there are huge amounts of jealousy, scores to be settled. And they realize that this is the time, because they then go to King Nebuchadnezzar and say to him in chapter 3, there are some Jews whom you've set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. That's very subtle, that, isn't it? It's you they're dishonoring here, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up. And it's at this point we see the character of the man, furious with rage, because someone has dared to stand against him. Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. So they're brought before him, and he says to them, is it true that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? And goes on to say to them, come on, guys, if you do not do this when the music strikes up next time, then you're going to be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. And ask them this great question. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? So again, we're getting a sense there. He believes that he and his gods are the most powerful. No one's going to rescue you from this. And I love the answer that comes. This answer would definitely be on my list of some of my favorite verses in the whole of the Old Testament. Because we read Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego reply to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, then the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. I love that sort of two sides of a coin there. King, we can't do this. And if that means you're going to throw us into this furnace, well, the God we serve can rescue us. And you know what? Even if he doesn't, we still won't do this.
What does it take to have principles like that?
My goodness. I mean, that's an incredible challenge to us today, isn't it? In our culture and facing our challenges, to be ready to to stand on our principles. Now, what I love is, they have shown incredible wisdom so far. They have really looked for every way they can that they can serve, they can bring godly wisdom into an alien culture, just like we can bring godly wisdom into our office or hospital or school or factory. But the point comes when we have to draw a line, when we have to say, I'm sorry, if that's the consequences of my believing it, then so be it. And I'm going to have to leave the consequences to God. But I cannot do what you are asking me to do. I think in the UK and in many parts of the West at the moment, we are coming to increasing numbers of scenarios where Christians are having to face that, where they are being asked to not only do things, but believe things, where they're being even told that to think differently to how, quotes, the culture, which normally, of course, means a narrow band of culture, but that has been shouting the loudest, where we're told that, there are certain things we cannot do, believe, or even think. And I think increasingly, with all the grace and wisdom that God will give us, having tried our hardest to work in the system, there's a point coming when we're going to have to say, well, I'm sorry, that's where I have to draw a line to be true to my God. And if you throw me into furnace, you throw me into a furnace. And God can rescue me. But you know what? Even if he doesn't, I'm still not going to turn against my God.
In the case of Daniel's friends, this was a real furnace, though.
It was a real furnace. And it was a real furnace that Nebuchadnezzar is so furious about. He has it sort of superheated. He orders the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. That's a sort of Hebraic way of saying incredibly hot, extremely hot. So he has it heated to the hottest that it has ever been, and has these 3 friends thrown into it. In fact, it's so hot that the soldiers who throw them into the furnace are overcome by the heat and are killed by it. That's how hot it is. And Nebuchadnezzar has them cast into this furnace, very real furnace, just as he said he would do.
And if anybody's been close to a bonfire, let alone a big burning building,
my goodness.
yeah, the mind boggles.
It absolutely boggles indeed. It's little wonder that those soldiers, died from the heat as they got close. But what about these 3 friends? Well, this is where the great surprise of the story comes. I mean, we've seen several surprises along the way. But as Nebuchadnezzar then looks at the furnace, there was some, obviously, viewing platform from where he could see what was going on. Again, a measure of the man he wanted to see, screaming, no doubt, with agony and pain. But as he looks into the furnace, we read these words. He says, weren't there 3 men that were tied up and thrown into the fire? And they said, yeah, absolutely, King. And then he says, but look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. So there in the furnace, not only are they not being burnt by these incredibly hot flames, someone's come into the furnace with them, a 4th that he calls a son of the gods, some angelic messenger from God. Now, some Christians have thought over the years that it was Jesus. Actually, there's nothing in the text to suggest that it was. But what it absolutely was an angel of God's protection walking there with them. And he, of course, now is absolutely overwhelmed and calls to them and says, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Pennies starting to drop. Come out. And as they come out, here's the amazing thing. We read this. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them.
Impossible.
Yeah, I mean, any of us know that you get anything near heat, there's that scorch smell, isn't there? But God has done the impossible. This fourth man sent from God, this angelic figure, has protected them. Why? Because Nebuchadnezzar needed to know that his god Nabu was not the God of the whole earth. Yahweh, the living God, the God of the Israelites, was the one true God of the whole earth. And how does Nebuchadnezzar respond to this? He says, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into rubble. For no other God can serve in this way." And he promotes them to an even higher place. Interesting, it's still not fully clicked for him. What he's done, though, is to grant protection to the Jews and given them permission to believe in their God, and has said that no one is to speak or act against them or their gods. He's pretty impressed, but he's still not fallen on his knees and said there is only one true God in heaven, and it's Yahweh, the living God. But what a surprise this must have been as that fourth man came in and he discovered that he was not quite as powerful as he thought he was.
But the consequences for others of the principles that those friends held were enormous.
Yes, I mean, the consequences, first of all, for the Jews in exile, who would now find that they were protected in exile, their worship was protected, and they would keep protected until Babylon would be conquered by Persia, and they'd eventually be allowed to go back home, 70 years after they'd first gone into exile, just as Jeremiah had prophesied. But of course, it's not just them. It's sort of, there's a spillover from that, I think, even for us today, because I think there is both, there's both encouragement and challenge out of this story for me, David. There's challenge because it seems to me that, many people today become Christians or live as Christians only for what they get out of it. And if things don't go their way or life gets tough, then, they slowly drift away. But these three friends, along with Daniel, demonstrate what true faith is. It means holding on to your faith in God, come what may, no matter what people say, no matter what people do against you. But these chapters are also great chapters in showing us how to stay true to God, but also how to exercise incredible wisdom in trying to work out our faith in an alien world that does not accept our values. We need to ask God, we want to hold on to what you say about this issue. Could you give me wise ways to express this, to live this out with those who don't live like that? But ultimately, all of us having to be ready to come to that point of saying, but God, if that means at the end of the day, standing for you means I have to get thrown into my inverted commas furnace, then so be it. I believe you can rescue me. I believe the fourth man can come and get me out, as I've seen God do in my own life many, many times. But to be in that place of faith that can say, like these three did, but God, even if you don't, we're still not going to turn to anyone but you. Or as someone once said to Jesus in the New Testament, Lord, to whom should we go? Because you have the words of eternal life.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.